Now, this morning we are finishing up something we started to do 6 weeks ago. Dave's going to get on to me to make sure the microphone's up. So that was an exploration of the parable told by Jesus that when the Son of Man returns, he will gather all nations, gather people before him, and divide them one from the other, and say to the ones on his right, "Come, you are blessed by my Father. Receive your inheritance, for I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And of course, as we know, hopefully as you know, those on his right said, "When did we see you hungry and thirsty and a stranger and naked and sick and in prison?" And Jesus, again, we know by heart now that Jesus said, "Well, when you did it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me." Hopefully, we know that passage by heart because these past weeks we've reflected on the hungry and the thirsty and the stranger and the naked and the sick, and how we are called to see Jesus in these very people in need. And I can freely admit to you this morning, and I can freely say that in most of these brothers and sisters, I have in some way participated in feeding the hungry. I've given food to food pantries. I've actually served at the homeless shelter, so I have seen Jesus in the hungry. I've given drink to the thirsty. One of the ways I've thought about that in ministry was helping to dig wells and for our brothers and sisters down in El Salvador. I have welcomed the stranger. Hopefully someone comes in here in the sanctuary and I've extended welcome to them. I can relate to that. I have in some small way clothed the naked. I've donated clothes to Goodwill and other places like that. And I promise you, I have visited the sick. But it strikes me, this truth, that in all my years of ministry, I have never, ever visited someone in prison. I have never seen Jesus in a prisoner. I might take a small poll. Has anybody raise their hand if they've seen someone? There's been, I can see, more hands than I expected, 3 or 4. But it struck me as I wrestled with this text, I have never gone to visit the prisoner. And it's one of the startling facts of life in our country that close to 2 million people are incarcerated. It's about 1% of our adult population. The U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration than any other, per population, than any other country in the world. It's not even close. 1 in 5 people in prison in the world are imprisoned here in the United States. And truth be told, this is not due to our communities, our societies having higher rates of violent crime than other countries. More often than not, it might be due, a more accurate descriptor for those going to jail might be rooted in other conditions, race and poverty. And even statistical reports indicate by the government itself that 500,000 people that are now in jail, in prison, are there even though they have not been convicted or sentenced for a crime. Their crime is not being able to afford bail. So I share these statistics this morning not necessarily to advocate for prison and judicial reform, though those would certainly be a worthy topic for a sermon. But I would like to ask of ourselves a deeper question, in some ways a more profound question that really troubles me and probably should trouble us all. Because of all the groups that Jesus identifies in this story, in this parable he tells, of all those groups, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, the stranger, I must confess, the one I find the hardest to see Jesus is in the prisoner. I find it probably harder to see Jesus in the least of these, my brothers and sisters, these 2 million prisoners in our country. And that might be part of the reason I've never ever visited a person in jail over my life. And as I thought about this and prayed about this and reflected on this, it occurred to me, I'm not sure I've even ever prayed for a prisoner. Not even prayed on Sunday morning and included the prisoner. And that might be due in many ways to my having a hard time seeing Jesus, because to be told of all the groups that are listed, they seem the least deserving. After all, don't we more often than not think their actions and decisions have led to their incarceration? Setting aside the obvious inequities of our sentencing structures, that's a topic for another time, I still think of the prisoner, if I even think of a prisoner, as someone to be feared, less human, someone who made a mistake so egregious they deserve their punishment. Murderers and rapists, those most harmful to our communities, must be imprisoned to protect ourselves. Justice for their victims is a righteous thing. Yet, Jesus doesn't make that distinction. He doesn't make a distinction that he is only in those prisoners worthy, but that he is in those and is expressed in the least of these. He's present in the prisoner. In a way, one might say, those we might think of as the most undeserving of our fellow human beings, those we'd rather push aside and not think about ever again. And I find this assertion very hard to come to terms with. Now, the text that Drew read for us this morning was Jesus' first sermon to his home congregation. And he reads a scroll from Isaiah in which he identifies as the one who's come to preach the good news to the poor, release to the prisoner. He's come to preach sight to the blind, to proclaim God's favor upon all those, on all God's children. And he asserts this preaching, this grace that he's preaching has become in his person fulfilled in their hearing. And we understand and we hear that in what Drew read that the congregation was quite amazed by this when he asserts that God's grace is here for all to experience. But then Jesus makes a rookie mistake preaching. Because he doesn't stop there. The congregation's clapping, they're standing. This is awesome. What we didn't read, what we could read in just the next few verses, is Jesus turns to his happy congregation and tells them the grace is so big, it's extended to those who don't deserve it. It's given to those, and he tells two stories from their tradition of those who were considered outside the covenant of God's love, and that God especially reached out to those undeserving. And you know what happens? They get ticked off, and they kick him out of the synagogue. Grace really is nice and good when it comes to us, when we think of ourselves deserving. It's a lot harder when we imagine it goes to the least of those we consider undeserving. Now, I don't know if you remember this, Paul Whitmer, a chaplain, he preached while we were doing our online recorded worship. He preached for us. His involvement as a chaplain in a ministry to prisons called Women at the Well, in which he shared his story of going and being part of their worship, and his insights that he got, and how he experienced this amazing understanding, something he never experienced. He'd been a pastor of many congregations, but it wasn't until he was in this prison preaching to these undeserving, broken human beings that the very meaning of what the declaration of forgiveness in worship really tries to express, how it began to become a new meaning for him when he worshiped with those prisoners. That these broken people, most of who had made grievous mistakes that harmed themselves, that harmed people around them, some of them would probably never leave the prison. Yet they yearned for that proclamation, the captive is set free. For that experience of forgiveness in a profound way they had never thought of it before. That the meaning of grace became far more complicated for him, far more expansive for him than he ever imagined. Grace, God's reckless love, is truly a hard thing to grasp. And that's the problem. Grace offends us. It challenges our sense of rightness and responsibility. God's love is truly reckless. Because Jesus defines himself in the less and least deserving, in the less and least worthy, in the less and least admirable. Many of you may have read this book by Brian Stevenson, an American lawyer. It was also made into a movie. He's founder of the Equality Initiative and wrote a book called Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. And he's a founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative, who in this initiative works tirelessly to help prisoners, to help the prisoner, trying to eliminate excessive and unfair sentencing, trying to help exonerate innocent death row prisoners, helping to confront the abuses of the incarcerated, helping to challenge the incarceration of the mentally ill, and aiding children prosecuted as adults. But one of his statements that he makes in this book is he asserts that each of us is more than the worst thing we have done. Each of us is more than the worst thing we have done. And there's a powerful word of grace in the midst of that, not only for those broken human beings who sit in our prisons, isolated, alone, who do not know and cannot know the truth of God's grace. Not only are they not simply the worst thing they have done, but Jesus asserts he is present to them in profound ways. And the good news for us is that even in the midst of our own prisons, the prisons we make, of our own struggles in life, in the sense that we feel least deserving or least worthy, is this truth. God's love, God's grace embraces us in the midst of that. And the challenge for us is that while we may be offended by that grace, can we truly proclaim it? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.